Алиса, как сказать всем привет по-китайски?
Всем привет, это
Даджа Хау.
Budget house. Bonjour à tous. Today I'm going to tell you about my trip to China. I spent 10 days visiting China from the south to the north, from Shanghai to Beijing, and it was a wonderful trip, so I want to tell you about that. I decided to do it in English for no good reason, just because I wanted to. And if you are not happy, of course, you can complain in the comment section. I know it's not a good strategy to change languages on YouTube, but it doesn't really matter to me because anyway, YouTube is for me a hobby and I share what I want to share. So in English, in Russian, in French.
Stop filming.
How is this possible? It's so slippery. So I wanted to tell you about my trip to China. I went to China for 10 days and it was the first time for me. It was one of my most interesting travel so far, though I traveled to many countries. It was probably the most different and one of the most difficult travels. So I was interested in China for a very long time, though I had never been to Asia before. Interested in China because of the political situation, the importance of China in today's world. Also because of the culture, I had read a few books about China. It's a very ancient and rich culture, so I was interested in China for that reason. And also because I noticed that the more languages I learn, especially Russian, the more opportunities it gives me to understand the world a little bit differently. Because, for example, English and French are very similar languages, so I don't feel much difference when I think and speak English compared to French. But when I have to switch to Russian, it's already completely different. It's a different language, a different way to say things and to think about things. So I thought that it would be very interesting to learn a language from Asia. So at first I started with Japanese. It was about 10 years ago and I dropped it. And to be honest, I like how Japanese sounds better than Chinese, but I'm more interested in Chinese culture than Japanese culture. So I have a vague idea about learning Chinese, but I'm still not exactly decided because I know it's a huge investment of time. So I haven't started it very seriously, and I thought that going to China would be a good opportunity to see if I'm really motivated for it or not. And by the way, if you're French and you want to improve your English skills and you want to get rid of your wonderful French accent, check out our partner Logios Online, who is a platform for learning languages, including Russian and English. I will put the link in the description. So in last December, when I saw that China had removed the need for French people to get a visa, to go to China for, I think it's 14 days or 15 days. I thought that it was the best opportunity to go to China. We have until November, I think, to go to China for tourism if we want, and we don't need to get a visa. I think it's for French people, for Germans, Italians, and a few others. I don't remember which ones, which nationalities. But anyway, it was a very good opportunity for me. So I started planning a trip. I took my tickets very early on for May, and I spent 10 days in China. So the first step for me was to find a pen friend, a Chinese pen friend, just so that it would be easier for me to understand how things work and to be able to talk about China before going, understand maybe the challenges. So I went to Tandem, I started talking to a few Chinese people, and I ended up meeting my pen friend, Ben. I was also very interested in China because I live in Russia, I live in Moscow. And I know that in the West, Russia has a very terrible reputation nowadays. People in the West tend to believe that it's a very dangerous and aggressive country. But I live here, I see that the reality is not exactly what we are told in the West. So for me, it was really important also to go to China and to check for myself how people live there and to really experience China, not through our media, but through my own eyes. Actually, even during my trip, I posted a short video about the things that I had seen in China. It was just a combination of a few pictures and images, videos that I had taken along the way. I edited them into a short and then I posted it on YouTube. And immediately there was a French guy, random French guy, who came to this video and who commented. After doing propaganda for Russia, I was now employed probably by China. to promote the country. Though I hadn't said anything in that video, in that short video. It was just like a combination of a few pictures and a few videos that I had taken in China. And he said something like it was really obvious that it wasn't my video, that it was probably a video provided by the Chinese propaganda party, I have no idea. So to me, it just confirmed that in the West, people are really brainwashed into thinking that everything that is not Western is necessarily bad, or everything positive about either Russia or China has to be propaganda. So it just makes me even more want to go to China and to explore this country also, as I still do with Russia. So yeah, I had a lot of reasons to go to China, and I'm really grateful that I was able to have this trip, 10 days in China. At first, I thought that I would organize my video by topics maybe, like for example, transportation, the language, the people, the culture, and things like this. But in the end, it will be easier for me to just tell my story and like tell you about those 10 days as they went. So just from first day to the last. So I took a plane, Chinese airline, I don't remember which one, I think it was Eastern Chinese airline or something like this, from Moscow to Shanghai. It takes about 9 hours. I traveled during the night, so I was really exhausted when I arrived, didn't sleep for very long. I'm lost. So when I looked out the window of the plane over Shanghai, I was really impressed by the amount of towers and high buildings. The air was not really clean, so it was kind of brownish, and I could see just only rows and rows of buildings. So I got a little bit of a negative impression when I arrived. It was a little bit like a dystopian landscape or something like this. Didn't feel very welcoming seen from the plane, and I thought, what am I doing there? Also, when I left Moscow, we were in the middle of second or maybe third winter of the year, so it was still snowing just a few days before I left. But when I arrived in Shanghai, it was really, really hot and humid, and I'm not really good at dealing with heat usually, so I was a little bit put off by this, really tired, a little bit lost. So my pen friend Ben joined me at the airport to help me with the first procedures, like for example, getting my Alipay account set up and things like this. So you can basically join your European or whatever Western bank card, Visa card, to your Alipay account, and that's how Chinese pay usually. They also use WeChat, so it's either Alipay or WeChat, but they don't use cash usually, and they don't use bank cards. And for Russians, unfortunately, the Russian cards don't work on Alipay, so you have to have a Western, like Visa or MasterCard or whatever, to create an account on Alipay. Then you have to have a VPN, of course, for everything, because even YouTube, WhatsApp, Instagram, of course, anything Western is blocked in China, so you have to use a VPN. And they don't, like our Western VPN don't always work in China, so the one that I used was V, I think, V+. But the ones that I use in Russia, usually Lantern VPN and Planet VPN, they don't work in China, so you have to be careful with that. Then there was also the SIM card, Chinese SIM card to get set up also. And I was ready to go. So just exiting the airport, the impression that I got was the heat, of course. It was the most obvious for me coming from Russia, from Moscow. The heat, the sun, and also the noise, because in China there is a constant noise. There are people everywhere, and they are not very discreet. They are very loud, usually very noisy. So that was quite overwhelming for me, especially coming from Russia, where people are more reserved and usually not very noisy in public spaces, at least compared to some other countries. In Russia already, it's much more comfortable for me than in France, where people are rather noisy, like the Chinese, less than the Chinese, but more noisy than in Russia. So in Russia, I feel much more comfortable because it's more quiet, more silent, and people are more reserved. But in China, people seem to really like noise, so they shout sometimes instead of talking to each other. They shout on the phone also. They use the honks in the cars or on the bikes also. There is a constant noise. So we use the taxi to go to the city, and the taxi in China are even more efficient, faster and more convenient than in Russia, which I didn't think was possible because I come from France, and in France taxis are really expensive, so I never used them when I was living in France, but in Russia I used them more often. because it's cheaper, it's convenient, it's really fast. In China, we had to wait for maybe maximum 2 minutes each time we were ordering a taxi. It's really, really cheap. Like I remember the last ride that we took, it was about 20 minutes and it costed 33 yuan. So it's like just a few euros basically. In Shanghai, the metro is also very comfortable. It's a bit less impressive than in Russia, but it's really efficient, clean, it works really well. The Russian subway, Moscow subway, is still the best that I've seen, but the Chinese one in Shanghai is really efficient too, especially given the enormous amount of people going around in Shanghai. It's really clean, I think. The signs in the metro are translated into English and it's the same all over the city, but people don't speak English. I thought that Russians don't speak English very well, but Chinese are way worse, and actually they don't speak at all usually. So the only people that I saw that I met who spoke a little bit of English were in Beijing, but otherwise in Shanghai or in the middle, like in other cities that I visited, I didn't meet anyone who spoke English, not even a few words, like zero. But the signs are translated, so you can still go around and find your way. I thought that the indications or directions in the subway in Shanghai or Beijing are maybe a little bit less well organized than in Russia, so it's maybe less easy to go around sometimes, especially in the train station or the big ones where you have an airport and a train station and the metro and everything. You don't really know where to go at first. It's not really easy to get around, whereas in Moscow, it's really easy. Even when it's the first time that you are coming to Moscow, it's quite easy to just find your way. So actually, my Russian friends managed to get lost in the subway in Moscow, which I don't understand how it's possible because it's really clear, but they do that. And sometimes I have to be the Susanin. So we went to a first restaurant with my band friends, and this restaurant had been recommended by one of his friends, so he was quite confident and we went together. And it was a local restaurant, noodle restaurant, really good, but it was completely full of local people, Chinese people, who were shouting and shouting. It was so noisy and so messy. So for a first contact with Chinese people and first impression of the city and the culture, it was really overwhelming. But I actually really enjoyed it because it's exactly what's interesting for me, how people live, like the daily local life. It's much more interesting than closed-off museums and things like this. I want to meet people, I want to see how they live, what they do on a daily basis. That's the most interesting for me when I travel. So it was a very good opportunity to see them. And I could notice straight away some cultural differences between China and especially Russia. In Russia, people are very polite, distant, and civil. Polite in the sense that they don't shout in public usually, they are more civil and, I don't know, discreet. Whereas in China, you have so many people all around the place that nobody cares about how they will be perceived by each other. They are less self-conscious maybe than we are in the West. And I include Russia in the West, because Russia culturally is much closer to the West than to the East, to China, though they don't want to hear about that nowadays, which I understand. So in China, you have to deal with people however you can. You cannot really expect them to be polite and to respect your space, or you have to struggle with them because there are so many people, once again, that people just don't have time or energy to keep distances and so on. It's just impossible. So you just have to adapt and to ignore people around you. It's the only solution. But for me, it's very difficult. Also, it was the first time that I had to use chopsticks in front of local people, so I was a little bit stressed about this. But very quickly, I learned that in China, table manners are not at all important. I come from France and from a more traditional family, maybe, and my mom was always very strict about table manners, like you should not make any noise when you eat, and you should never drop anything, of course. You should keep your hands like on the table and be really polite and follow all those rules. But in China, you just eat however you want. So at first, I thought that people were really skilled with chopsticks and would never drop anything, but actually they drop everything. And it's completely normal. Apparently, it doesn't matter if half of your plate ends up on the table instead of in your mouth. It doesn't matter, and nobody will judge you for that. But I felt very self-conscious, especially when you have to kind of slurp the noodles in and you make a lot of noise, of course, if you want to swallow them. I could almost hear my mom and what she would say, so I felt very self-conscious about making all this noise. But I managed to eat. I could see that the Chinese around me were like discreetly checking how I was holding my chopsticks, and probably my style was not exactly the best, my form not perfect, but at least I could eat, and that was a relief. I was also very surprised at the restaurant to see that people were leaving half of their meal uneaten, just leaving them to be thrown away. And I understand that noodles or rice or these kind of things are not very expensive, so you can probably afford to waste, but I was still very surprised to see so much waste. And it was the same during the whole duration of the trip. People are wasting way more than we are in the West, and especially in France. Growing up, I was always told that I had to finish my plate because poor Chinese don't have enough to eat. And when I go to China, I see that they waste everything, like way more than we do in the West. I was very surprised at that. I didn't expect it. And it's not only noodles and rice that they waste, but just anything, basically. The portions that are served are really huge, and it's just impossible to finish them, so I don't know. When I asked my pen friend about it, he said that it's Chinese tradition to be really generous and to provide the host with a lot, or the guest rather, with large amounts of food. So you have to have large amounts of food on the table. It's some kind of hospitality tradition. But when you go to the restaurant, I don't know, it's kind of different setup in my opinion. It's not like you're invited, you just pay for the service. So I don't know how this is hospitality. But anyway, yeah, I was really surprised at this, and I still feel quite guilty when I have to throw away things because of my French education and my mom. So so from the plane, from what I had seen by the window or through the window, I don't know how to say this properly. Anyway, I thought that Shanghai would be not such a beautiful city because of all of those concrete buildings. But when you're in the city, it's completely different. There is a lot of green areas, lots of trees, lots of space. So it seems that with this humidity, this amount of sun and heat, anything can grow in the south of China, or in Shanghai at least. So the city is actually not at all what I thought from the plane. It's quite agreeable actually. Even if you have also high buildings everywhere, it doesn't actually feel too oppressive or something like this because of all this greenery everywhere. And there is a lot of beauty in Shanghai, lots of little shops, lots of beautiful buildings, and life going on all around with lots of activity, people everywhere, bikes, cars. So you always have something to see, something curious, something interesting, especially because it was the first time that I went to Asia. So everything was interesting to me. So on this first day in Shanghai, we took a tourist bus, I guess, to see more of the city, which is quite a comfortable option. So you go around the main buildings in Shanghai. So we ended up close by the river, looking at the city center, the towers, the buildings and everything. It's really beautiful. It's very crowded too, and there are very few foreigners. On this day, even though we saw thousands and thousands of people, I saw probably like 10 or 15 foreigners. I mean, foreigners from the West. And I understand why, in a sense, because it's rather difficult to go around in China if you don't know the language, you don't know the culture, and so on. You need someone like a local person to help you and accompany you. But it's such an interesting country that I still don't really understand why people don't go to China more often. And in the evening, we took a dragon boat to see the city by night, which was really wonderful. So there is a buffet on the first floor, so I got to try some more dishes and to still practice my skills with chopsticks. And then you can just go around the boat and look at the view, stuff like this. I think it lasted for maybe 1 hour. And I was on the deck of the boat with my pen friend and trying to remember some kanji, some Chinese characters. For me, languages are really interesting. I can feel that my brain is more awake each time I'm trying to understand something new with a new language. So I was really enthusiastic about learning Chinese signs. And the easiest ones really stuck to my mind very fast. But the issue is sounds in Chinese. It's very difficult for me to tell them apart or to remember them, especially because of the 4 tones. So you have to pronounce things with one syllable with the appropriate tone. And this is very difficult for me to remember. The only thing that I remember from the trip is 不要, which means I don't want. Though each time I tried to use it on some Chinese people who wanted to sell me some magical products or something like this, it didn't work because they still followed me for 10 minutes. So I probably didn't say it the right way. 不要, Alisa. Что значит 不要 по-китайски?
Сдается мне. Буял. Это буял.
On the next day, we took a train to go to a small village not very far from Shanghai. The train stations in Shanghai or in China in general is just another scale. I've never seen such big places, big train station. And it's really well organized, really clean. It's very crowded, but you always have somewhere to sit. It's organized usually in the same way. So you have a first floor with some shops and everything that you might want to buy, some restaurants, cafes, and so on. Though there is no cafe really in China. They don't seem to be addicted to caffeine as we are in the West and in Russia. So they drink tea and milk tea, which is really delicious. But each time I wanted coffee, it was much more difficult to find. And you have a few brands like KFC, McDonald's, Burger King, or Starbucks, where you can find coffee. But it's really expensive and not many people seem to enjoy this, which I don't understand because I'm addicted to. So for taking the train, you need to register your passport, which was a little bit messy because my pen friend tried to do it online. It didn't work. So we had to go to a first station in Shanghai somewhere to find someone to register me with my passport. So as a foreigner, you usually have a little bit more trouble to go around, but in Russia it's actually the same sometimes. In Russia you use your passport to travel also, instead of using your tickets as we do in France. But my passport is probably rather different from the Russian passports, so usually people who want to check my information don't really know where it is on my passport, where it's written and so on, and they struggle a lot. And in China, there are way less foreigners than in Russia. So it's not really surprising that it's more difficult for foreigners to travel. By the way, in Russia, when you go to a train station, you have to pass through a security check. In China, it's the same. It's even stricter. Can we say stricter? More strict, I don't know, than in Russia. And you also have to go through this check when you go to the metro. So sometimes you can have a little crowd to go through to get into the station, be it like subway station or train station. And usually Chinese people use their, I guess it's identity card or the equivalent of it, to travel because the train tickets are linked to their card, so they just need the card to pass. And it's the same with the passport, so usually you can just scan your passport and take your train, but it doesn't always work, so you have sometimes to ask for someone to help you with that. They won't speak English for sure, so it's better to have your papers in order and your documents ready. From what I could see, the public places in China, like train station, subway, everything is really clean. But in general, if you go to maybe less touristic places, it's not exactly the same. And if you go to public washroom, for example, it's not as clean. And usually they don't have toilet paper, sometimes they don't have soap, and people don't seem to care. So this is very surprising for me because with the number, with the huge population that they have, it's no wonder that viruses should spread if people don't follow basic hygiene rules. And this was something that I didn't like in China really, because I don't know, when you're traveling you really want to wash your hands sometimes and there is not even soap, so you have to anticipate for that and to keep everything in your bag, I guess. But the problem is that if nobody cares, they will just spread everything you don't want to be spread around the country. So it made me not so comfortable to see that hygiene is not a priority. And actually I was surprised because many people wear masks in the city center, so I thought maybe it's for pollution, but from what my pen friend told me, it's not for pollution, it's for limiting the risk of diseases and so on. But I don't understand, you wear a mask, but at the same time nobody's washing their hands and everything, so it doesn't really make sense. On this topic also, I complained a few videos ago that Russian men tend to spit on the ground, and I don't like it. I think it's disgusting. But in China, it's another level of spitting. In Russia, you don't see it every day. You see it sometimes, more than in France. But in China, it's really all over the place. I've seen women do it in China, which I didn't see in Russia, and also blowing their nose with one finger, and yeah. But I think that these kind of habits can be erased very easily if the government starts pasting signs that you shouldn't spit in public places and things like this, which they don't in China. There is no sign for like telling you not to spit. So I think it could be like this bad habit, I want to say, could be removed very, very fast. A few times in the train in China, I heard like, please don't remove your shoes, please don't eat stinky fruits in the train, but there is no instruction telling you not to spit. So the second day we went to a village, and it was the most wonderful thing that I had ever seen. I didn't even know that such places still exist, and it was like maybe diving into a movie or a video game or something like this.
Of southwest China.
Mm-hmm. The atmosphere in the village was really picturesque and traditional and ancient. It was really wonderful, with red lanterns everywhere and old pavement, green everywhere also, plants growing everywhere, flowers. I don't know, it was really incredible. And many Chinese women were wearing traditional clothes, or maybe not so traditional, but at least they imitated traditional clothing. Or makeup even. Well, I'm not too fond of the Chinese traditional makeup because it looks kind of weird, because they paste some really, really white, paste on their face, and just on the face, so then you can see the real color of the skin under it, and it's really weird to be so white, but it makes the ancient and traditional atmosphere even more present and realistic around you. So I really like this. Men don't do the effort of wearing traditional costume because sometimes men are very boring and they don't want to wear costumes. But many women do, especially for the pictures. And indeed, it's very picturesque, so everybody was taking pictures. By the way, that was also interesting for me because I come from France, where women usually don't really take pictures and don't wear a lot of makeup. We're very self-conscious and judgmental in France, so we try to keep it down and not to expose ourselves too much or attract attention on our makeup and everything. Usually in France, or more traditionally, even though things change a lot, of course, we try to dress more elegantly. But in Russia, women really like attracting attention and being more seductive maybe, so they wear more makeup, more revealing clothes, and they like attention, so they take pictures and selfies all the time without seeming to feel self-conscious at any point, especially in Moscow. And in China, I wondered if it would be the same, and they seem to like pictures also, but they act in a more innocent manner, maybe less seductive, but more like babyish maybe. And even the makeup is a bit different. It makes them look maybe younger and more pale, whereas in Russia, they look more mature or more seductive with the makeup that they put on. But there are similarities definitely between Chinese women and Russian women. Like, I can take a small and stupid example, but for example, the nails. They like also in China to have really long, like pointy nails, which I absolutely don't understand because this is just not practical. So we walked around this village, this wonderful village, for a few hours. We took a boat also. It started raining, so it's even added to this atmosphere, like mysterious, really picturesque atmosphere. I really felt like in a movie, something like this. I tried also some weird tofu food with whole shrimps in them, in my soup. And I thought that I was a brave person when it comes to food, because usually I really try to try the local food, and even if I don't like it, I at least try. So I thought that I was a brave woman when it comes to that, especially when comparing myself to Americans and Brits that I met that don't want to try anything new because they just want their, burgers and everything. I remember when I was in England, I was working, and they asked me to bake cakes, and I tried to bake a crumble, but there were some apples in the crumble, and they don't seem to think that fruits and vegetables are edible in England. They only want chocolate, sugar, and potatoes. So I quickly understood that I had to adapt and to bake only chocolate cakes, and the most that they could swallow was banana, but apples were already too much. So by comparison, I thought that I was a very brave person, and trying all sorts of foods and everything. But in China, I realized that I was mistaken. I understood my limits very early on, And even the shrimps, whole shrimps in my soup, you don't really taste it, but just the crunchiness of it and seeing their little black eyes looking at you from the soup, But I tried. This I tried. Then some other things I didn't try. Many of them. For example, Chinese seem to be really fond of chicken or duck feet, and they are all over the place, chicken feet especially. And I thought that maybe it's like in France and it's the same as frog legs or things like this, that it's mostly for tourists to try. And French people don't actually eat them. But in China, when you go to any supermarket, you can find those kind of really weird, not really attractive to me, at least, things like chicken feet. And the worst probably was duck eyes. This is really like, why? maybe it's delicious. Maybe I'm just a spoiled, cowardly Westerner, but I didn't try the duck eyes or the chicken feet. But apart from that, the food is really good and they give you huge portions. There are lots of different types of kind of pasta. Russians call them pelmeni, and it would be like ravioli in French, like pasta with something inside. Like bao they have, or I forgot all the names actually. I really need to learn Chinese. But anyway, it's very yummy. You have lots of soups. When there is no shrimp inside, it's really delicious. Lots of fried rice. The food is not the most healthy, I would say, because it's always fried, or most of the time. Sometimes you can get some steamed things, but most of the time it's fried and very fat. But you can find lots of delicious things. I was a little bit scared about also hygiene when it comes to restaurants, because I could see that it's not the most important thing in the world for people in general in daily life. So I thought that maybe in the restaurant it would be the same, but actually I didn't get sick. So maybe I'm lucky, or maybe I was scared for nothing. So I didn't really try street food or foods that might be more risky to eat. In this village, I was the only foreigner that I could see, at least. So of course I attracted more attention. And it's a little bit embarrassing when you see that everybody's looking at you and you cannot really understand what they say, though you understand that they are speaking about you. So my pen friend was telling me, oh, they're paying you compliments and saying that you're pretty girl and pretty foreigner and so on. But actually I have no proof. But definitely people were looking at me and noticing that I was a foreigner, and the shop owners also were trying to get me to go to their shops and everything. So I bought a Chinese costume because I really wanted to try. I really like costumes, trying them on, especially foreign ones. It's really fun, I think. And it makes the landscape around look really pretty when you have plenty of people who are wearing beautiful costumes. And I understand why in France we don't really want to wear our old traditional countryside costumes, because they don't look exactly beautiful. But still, it's a pity that we don't do it casually, like wearing traditional clothing. I think it's really wonderful. And in China, once again, people don't seem to be very self-conscious. They wear sometimes really weird stuff, and so they don't have a problem wearing traditional clothes. So I just bought this shirt and a skirt, Chinese skirt, blue one, really beautiful also. But of course I attracted even more attention with that, and it's not really practical because it was really long, and when it started raining it just absorbed all the water around. It weighed like 15 kilos after half an hour. Anyway, it was a really dreamy, wonderful day in a wonderful village. So if you go to China, I would really advise you to take a hotel in the village. By the way, for hotels, apparently it's not so easy to book them when you're a foreigner, because sometimes in very fine prints, all in Chinese, it's written that the hotel doesn't accept foreigners. So my pen friend had to be really careful each time we were booking a hotel, because sometimes I was not supposed to be there. And it's not obvious, it's not written on the first page. But I guess if you use Booking or some international websites, it would be more obvious. Though I don't know if Booking actually works in China, I forgot. But already after those 2 days, I could see that China is really contrasted between the modern side of it, like the technology in the big cities, those high buildings, the high tech and everything, and those traditional villages. The fact that people really want to preserve their culture, which I really appreciate, because even in the city you have plenty of buildings that look ancient, even if probably they're not, but they still build in the style of ancient China, and it looks incredible. They also put a lot of attention to small details, and there is a lot of beauty even in, like for example, I remember the subway tickets in Shanghai. They were really pretty, and it's a small thing, but still it makes your day better. People in China seem to really enjoy beauty and to try to bring it forth. So that's something I really appreciated in China, seeing beauty all around. Also in the products that they sell, I expected most products to be of low quality, because like when we say made in China, usually it means plastic, or we associate it sometimes in the West with low quality. But actually, I don't know, like when I was in China, I didn't notice that things or souvenirs and everything were low quality. On the contrary, I would say that it was much better quality than when we have on average for the same price in the West. Maybe what they sell to the West is low quality, but in China you can find plenty of things of very high quality, even on a daily basis. For example, when I was ordering coffee or milk tea, they use very high quality, thick plastic with pretty delicate designs. And you feel almost ashamed to throw away the cup after drinking your tea, because it's really pretty, much prettier than what we have in France, and much higher quality. There is a lot of waste in China, lots of plastic waste, though they try to change it from what I could see. There are lots of signs telling you, please don't waste water, things like this, but it seems focused on very specific areas of wasting, like water especially, water or paper in the bathroom, for example. But when it comes to plastic waste, like when you're ordering food and things like this, there is a huge amount of waste. It's the same when you go to a shop or when you order food, they give you not paper bag, but really high quality. It's probably plastic bag, but it looks like almost fabric, and it's really thick, really durable. So I was impressed at the quality of products all around. During the whole trip, I struggled with paying with Alipay, because basically they give you a QR code that you scan from your application Alipay. But if this QR code is a private one, it's not like a company, but it's just a private person who is selling you something, like in the village where we went, then I couldn't pay because the Visa... That's my neighbors. So my Visa card would be refused. I needed a Chinese bank card linked, or a Chinese account linked to my Alipay if I wanted to transfer money to a private person. So sometimes I couldn't pay, and I was really lucky that my pen friend was around, because he could help in those situations, because it's kind of impossible to explain that to Chinese. And of course I used a translator from time to time, but it's just much more complicated to communicate with people. So I have the worst bank in the world, my French bank, Société Générale. I really don't like them, and they block me all the time. They removed my option for making payment in the middle of the trip, which was a little bit annoying. So each time I had to pay for something, I was praying. And then the next step was going to Hangzhou, I guess. Hangzhou, I don't know how to say it properly. And there we went for a long walk around a very famous lake, which was too famous because it was completely crowded, and it was especially very noisy once again because of the crowd, because everybody's shouting, and you have also small buses, like tourist buses, which play a tune, very repetitive, and they blast it and they honk, and everybody's just making so much noise. It's really overwhelming. That's something that's difficult to get used to. Also, you have to be really careful when you go around in China, because people are not going to slow down if they see you from their bikes or from their cars. So it's your responsibility when you're just walking around to be really careful and to avoid an accident. The lake was really beautiful. As soon as you get away from the crowd, it's really peaceful. The nature is really wonderful around the lake. And you have, once again, old buildings that add to the picturesque, I guess. And once again, plenty of Chinese women wearing traditional clothes for the pictures, but also just for walking around, because it's fun. In the evening we tried some kind of restaurant with the weirdest food that I have ever tried, and it was pretty good, I have to say. Not something that I would eat every day, but it was especially really strange tastes. And in China they seem to mix sweet things and savory things within the same meal. They will bring you something sweet and then some meat, and it seems a little bit all mixed up, because in France it's really important to have first all the savory things and the sweet things at the end of the meal. And in France, everything is really regulated. So each time I go abroad, I'm still surprised at how people eat compared to France, where we have to do it like all the time, in the same way, starting with entrée, like starters, I guess. Then you have the main dish, plat principal. Like usually it's some legumes or vegetables and some meat. And then you have fromage, of course, the cheese. And then you have a dessert. And then you have a coffee and some chocolate. So it's really well organized, and you follow the same, like the meals are always organized in the same fashion, at least when you try to have a traditional like French meal. The first time I went to Canada, people were just like making some food, leaving it on the table, and then the kids would eat whenever they wanted, just like taking a piece of food and going away. And usually it was sandwiches, things like this. So I was really shocked. In China, it seems that they bring big plates of food, big dishes. Then everybody's just sharing, like taking with their chopsticks and not even having their own plates, just eating out of the same dish. But anyway, it was really interesting to try some new foods. I have no idea about what I was eating. I still have no idea actually. But it was pretty tasty and interesting. I can actually eat tentacles. It was the first time I tried to eat tentacles because I have to force myself to swallow these kind of squishy things, but I can actually eat them without being too disgusted, so I'm really proud of myself in the end. As for service in the restaurant, I would say that it's less good than in Russia maybe. In Russia it's really impeccable. Usually people are really, like the waiters are really polite and professional. And in China it's more fast, I would say. Like you have so many people around that waiters don't really have time to... Maybe it depends on the restaurant also, but on average I would say that the quality is quite good. Not as good as in Russia, but probably better than in France. Another surprising things at the... Do we say in the restaurant or at the restaurant? Is that they usually give you hot water instead of cold water. So it's not even tea or anything. There is nothing inside. It's just water, but it's kind of warmish or hot. So when I ask people, why do you do that? Because it's already so hot outside, like plus 30 or something. And they still drink hot water or warm water. And apparently it's, first of all, because they think that it's healthy for some reason. I don't know why. And also because of habits, I guess, because people got used to boiling water to just clean it, and so they got used to drinking hot water or warm water. In Russia, they also don't drink out of the tap, though I think it's kind of safe because I do it all the time. And then I get scolded by the Russians around, but still, I'm still there and not dead, and I never got sick from it, at least not in Moscow. But they still usually filter the water. They don't boil it, they filter it, and in China it seems that they boil the water. And in China I wouldn't try to drink out of the tap, definitely. And then we walked around the city center during the night, and it was incredible once again. The atmosphere is just like something out of a movie. You have so many things to see, so many small shops, very picturesque, and a mix of tradition and new things and modernity. It's a bit messy, but you have a lot of animation in the street, lots of people just running around, many strange things to see, random things. Sometimes you enter a shop and you have no idea, like half of the products are just not understandable for me. I don't see the point, I don't see the purpose, it looks completely absurd, and it's really fun to see. Of course, lots and lots of food everywhere. I didn't try so many things actually. I was really surprised at some smells, which I had never smelled before. And from what I understood, it was stinky tofu, for example. This you can smell from like the end of the street. You will smell it, and it's not the most attractive smell in the world. It smells like, I would say, old eggs. And there is also this fruit, durian. I don't know how to say it in English. A very stinky fruit also. I tried it once in mochi, those kind of small bubbles of Japanese cakes. And it was not so bad, but the smell is really awful. And they have it in every supermarket, so you can smell the supermarkets from far away because of this. It covers any other smell. I regretted a lot that I couldn't speak any Chinese because people seem to be rather extroverted and they really want to try to speak to you very often. They seem to have an easy contact in the sense that even when they don't know each other, they can talk very freely and laugh very easily in the taxi and things like this. And in the West, we're much more reserved. I guess it's because of the climate, because it's warm and sunny in China, and it just makes people more extroverted, I think. if we compare it to Scandinavia, like I lived in Sweden for some time and people are really, really scared of each other. They just don't want to see each other. And in Finland, it seems even worse. But in China also, there is a sense of community that seems much stronger than what we have in the West. And I noticed it especially in older people. Like, I noticed, first of all, that in China, most people are middle-aged. From what I could see in the streets, people that I would see, you have, of course, young people, very old people, like babies, families, but most people are like, I don't know, 50, around 50. And people who are about this age or a little bit older, they seem to really enjoy life much more than what we can see in Russia. Though the situation, like economic situation for ordinary people is not necessarily much better in China than in Russia. But for older people, life seems to be much better in China than in Russia. In China, they really seem to enjoy life. They just go around dancing, for example. Very often you can see, especially old ladies, who are dancing to some music or even singing, playing games together, drinking tea and having lunch together. They seem to have a very strong sense of community, maybe family also, but it seems that they are friends and not really family members, just gathering together and having a good time. And also, I already talked about this, but they don't seem to be self-conscious at all, so they don't really care about what other people are going to think about them, which makes sense because there are so many people in China that you can't really afford to care about everybody around. So they just enjoy their life and just living. I don't know, I liked all the people in China. They seemed to be really happy. On the next day, we went to visit another village, which was not very far away, again taking the train. And it was a little bit more touristic, maybe, this village, so more people. Also because we didn't book a hotel in the village, so maybe you enjoy more the atmosphere and the place when you sleep there, I guess, because then you can, like, walk until late in the evening and or maybe early in the morning and there are less tourists around. Also, it was really hot. And when it's hot, I cannot do anything. But still, it was yet another really beautiful place with very few tourists from the West. With lots of little shops where they offer souvenirs and things like this. They also seem to have like a traditional activity maybe of dyeing? How do you say dying? Dying. As not like to die, but to dye. Like changing the color of some piece of clothing. It seemed to be like some traditional craft from this specific village, and they used the color blue. There were also temples with some Chinese gods, which I don't know anything about, and I should really learn more about China and Chinese culture, but there is so much to learn about in this world. So everybody was just walking around, drinking milk tea, which is really delicious and refreshing, so I understand why people choose it over coffee. By the way, it's a completely random piece of information, but people seem to smoke a lot also in China, which was surprising to me. And they smoke old cigarettes. Like in Russia, they seem to prefer electronic cigarettes nowadays, at least in Moscow. It's more fashionable, I guess, but in China they still smoke good old cigarettes. They can do it inside, in a restaurant, I saw it. Even though it's supposed to be forbidden, there are signs about this, but people don't really care. So once again, I really felt the contrast between cities and villages. And also in the train, I could see fields, things like this. So in the south, it seems to be much more green than in the north of China. And there seemed to be more mountains from what I could see. And as we progressed towards the north, it seemed more flat and more maybe agricultural lands. So I could see lots of peasants who were working by hand and carrying heavy loads on their backs, things like this. So I was also surprised at the contrast between the cities, which are so modern and everything, and so full of technology, and then the peasants are still working by hand in the fields, which I had never seen in any other country. So after this village, we went to another city, Zhengzhou, I don't know how to say it really. And we visited the family of my pen friend. So it was really interesting for me to see China from inside of a family I really like this kind of experience, and I was lucky enough to have it in many countries. So I was welcomed really warmly by the family, though I didn't speak Chinese and they didn't speak English, so that was a little bit more complicated. But still, we can still understand each other with the language of food, especially. And in China, it's the same as in Russia. People really want to feed you a lot. So we had hot pot together with the family, which is basically you have a pot filled with some kind of broth, maybe, with lots of things inside. So you have some pieces of meat, pasta, or noodles, or tofu, whatever, vegetables, and everybody's just cooking things together and then eating them and sharing the food. I think there is really something symbolic about sharing food like this, in this manner, which we don't do at all in the West, in France, for example. So in France, we have a big culture around food, but everybody has a separate meal of his own in his plate. And in China, the fact that you share from the same dish, you share the food, I don't know, it creates some kind of bond, I guess, in between people. And maybe that's a reason why they seem to have a good sense of community, and the old people don't seem to feel as lonely as in the West, because there is this sense of family, but also a sense of community more general, where you can see, once again, older people gathering together and sharing food and sharing just a good time. So probably that's something that we should copy from the Chinese, because it's a big problem to be isolated. In the West, it's very common, and people feel lonely, even though we are so many of us all just living in the same space, but we don't talk to each other, we don't bond as much, and I think it's a big problem. So anyway, we walked around the city also, and it's not a touristic place, so I was really looked at as if I was coming from the moon. And I'm a very self-conscious person in general. I really don't like when several people are looking at me, and I know I'm on YouTube, but it's completely different. Like, it's a different context. I'm in front of my camera, I can record as many times as I want if I say something stupid, which I always do. But when in real life several people are giving me attention at the same time, or I have to speak in front of several people, it's a big problem for me. Or even just walking around, I feel really self-conscious. Each time I notice that someone is looking at me, I'm like, what happened? What's wrong with my face? So this, I didn't get used to it, and it was quite embarrassing. But it's also because I don't speak Chinese, and once again, I couldn't understand them, and I don't know the culture so much. So probably if I would speak Chinese and know the culture better, I wouldn't feel so self-conscious or so embarrassed. Also, people were mostly positive. I couldn't see any hostility, for example, towards me. It was mostly curiosity, I would say, surprise, or sometimes also they wanted to get my attention, like to make me buy something from them, or to get my number also when I was walking alone. But in general, it was mostly positive or neutral. And especially when I was wearing Chinese clothes, surprisingly, because in the West we are convinced that it's not politically correct to wear clothing from other cultures, which is completely stupid in my opinion, like cultural appropriation, things like this, because it's exactly the opposite of how local people perceive it. Because for them it's mostly flattering to see foreigners who try to adopt their culture, try to imitate them, try to appreciate their culture. So it's mostly flattering, it's not at all insulting or anything like this. So anyway, I never believed in cultural appropriation anyway. The next day we went to Kaifeng to visit some kind of old city. It was really hot. It's really surprising for me that in China the south is more cool and more humid than the north, because usually in most countries it's the reverse, or at least in France it's the reverse. The north is usually more humid and more cold, and the south is dry and very warm. So usually I like the north better, but in China I like the south better. Also because of the amount of plants all around in the south, it looked really wonderful. And in the north it's more dry maybe. When we got out of the train station, the train was kept cool with the AC, and when we just exited the station, it was really overwhelming. The sun and the heat, it was more than 30 degrees, which is really my limit. So I felt more at home in the south of China. But it was really interesting to visit Kaifeng. Once again, many things to see, but almost nothing is translated to English, so you have to kind of guess what's happening around. By the way, it's the same in the restaurants and cafes and things like this. Usually it's not translated. So I tried sometimes to translate the name of the dishes, with a translator, but it doesn't make any sense. So you have to know or type them somehow on Google and then get the pictures, because otherwise you don't know what you're going to get. And there are no pictures on many menus, so it's completely random. At some point I wanted some milk tea, and it was in Beijing, I think. I was alone, so I took a picture of the menu and I translated it with Google Translate, and I obtained like some names as a blood rice or something like this. I had no idea what this meant, so I just asked the guy, please just choose the best for me, because I have no idea. Then we went to Beijing and I had to spend 2 days on my own visiting the city. So at first I was a bit scared, especially because my pen friends told me, be careful because you're going to be kidnapped by some Chinese guys, and they are going to sell you as a wife to some southern farmer and you're going to have 14 kids. Anyway, I was a bit scared, but I traveled a lot already and I get used to situations very fast. So I feel comfortable very fast in a new situation. So after just a few hours, I already felt completely normal walking around on my own in Beijing. And of course, it's not comfortable to get so much attention from people, especially when you don't understand the language, but I didn't feel scared. Also, I tried to use at first Google Maps or Yandex Maps, even the Russian version, for going around, but it doesn't work. So I downloaded the Chinese app, which is entirely in Chinese and not translated, but I could just copy-paste when I needed or compare the Chinese writing to what I could see on the signs in the street. So I got used to it very fast, and it's not very complicated. Even if you don't speak Chinese, you can just like look at the kanji and compare and try your best. And I didn't get lost. I mean, as long as you have an internet connection, I think it's quite difficult to get lost in this world, which is kind of sad. So I went to Beijing, to the city center, and I wanted to see the Forbidden City and to see Tiananmen Square, but it was completely blocked because somehow I managed to arrive there at the time where Putin was visiting the exact same spot. So everything was blocked and there were the police everywhere. And it was completely random because I had planned my travel a few months before and I had no idea that Putin would be there at the same time. So I couldn't see Tiananmen Square and I got lost everywhere because everything was blocked and you couldn't get to any point, and the police were just pushing you around. And actually they spoke English in Beijing, at least a little bit, and even the police did. And they were a little bit embarrassed to talk to a foreigner, embarrassed because of their English. Also, it's the same reaction than in Russia. Like when you try to speak to people in a professional situation, policemen or waiters, when they know that they have to offer you some kind of service and their English is not very good, they feel a little bit embarrassed about or self-conscious about their level in English. But you also have sellers, especially in China, who will run after you, even if they don't speak any word of English. They will try to sell you something. So I walked around this area. There is a park also a little bit above the Forbidden City, and I just walk around this park to look at the city from above. And you have to be careful, by the way, if you want to visit the Forbidden City, because they allow, I think, 40,000 visitors every day, and apparently that's not enough because there was not any booking available until the next month, so you have to plan that in advance. And actually I don't regret that I didn't get to visit this Forbidden City because it was completely crowded, and I know that it would just have been some kind of fight to survive instead of looking at the building, even though I would really want to see it for myself. But when it's so crowded, you just don't enjoy anything, so it was a bit pointless to try and visit it. And same thing for the Tiananmen Square. But I went below to the south of the square, and there are some commercial streets, open air shopping center maybe. And it was really, really nice to walk around there. Though I was once again the only white person, and I was especially the only white woman on her own, so I attracted too much attention. And each time I tried to sit down somewhere to have a rest, someone would just come up to me and try to talk to me in Chinese. Each time I would also go in front of a shop, the seller would jump up and try to call me. And for someone who doesn't really like to attract attention, it's really embarrassing to see them like all running after you. especially because I was on my own. I saw quite a lot of foreigners in Beijing, especially groups, and it was mostly French, which I understand because we don't need a visa this year, so it makes sense, and a lot of Russians also. It was kind of funny because I saw a foreigner, like a white person, maybe every half an hour or every hour. And each time you just look at each other and there is some kind of instant bond because you know that probably you can understand each other and you can speak the same language or at least a little bit. So it's, yeah, instant bonding, especially because I was alone. I tried to find some clothes also because I like Chinese taste much more than Russian taste. In Russia it's usually too much, so when we speak about makeup or about fashion or about even house things, when I go to shops in Russia, usually my eyes are hurting after a while because it's so many patterns, different patterns of bright colors. I tried to go once to a shop for, like, I don't know, home shopping with cushions and everything, and it was just awful. I never went back there in Russia because it's so many flowers, so many patterns, like leopard cushions, and then you have zebra cushions, and then tons of flowers, and everything is just over the top. So I don't really like it. But in China you can find plenty of very beautiful things, more delicate, more elegant maybe, and the clothes are better quality than in Russia. In Russia I guess the situation will change because it's mostly because all the brands went away not so long ago, so they have now to adapt to the situation. But clothes are rather expensive and not very high quality. And I thought that in China it would be cheaper, the clothes would be cheaper. So I was very happy to see them because there were so many pretty dresses and everything with very delicate patterns, but they were actually super expensive. So I think, from what I understand, that Chinese shop only online, and online the prices are reasonable, but if you go to commercial centers it's actually much more expensive than in the West and in Russia. So I was surprised at this and kind of disappointed because you see so many pretty things and the price is like 120 euros for a dress, and I'm not paying that. And also it was a bit difficult because once again each time I entered a shop there was one or two shop assistants who would just follow me, but really like breathing in my ear, and they would not leave me alone. Like I couldn't do anything without them being behind me, and I tried not to take it personally, but I guess it's because they thought that they could like have a good deal with a foreigner, which is absolutely not true, with me at least. And then I was still on my own in Beijing, and I visited the next day the Summer Palace. I thought it would be less touristic than other places, but actually it was not. There were so many people and it was really hot with not a breath of air. So it was difficult to enjoy. Like the place is really beautiful. You have a big park to visit and some old buildings also to see. You can climb up to the top building and then have a look at the landscape. But once again, it's really overwhelming to have so many people all around. Sometimes I had silent and very cute interactions, especially with kids, because they would just stare at me and sometimes like ask something to their parents and just stare at me again. But it was really cute from the kids. I understand that they don't see foreigners so often, so of course it's interesting for them. But as soon as I would smile or, I don't know, wave my hands, they would do it back and smile also, so it was really cute. I had a couple of those kind of interactions, like silent interactions with other people. Like I remember once in the subway, there was some kind of employee of the subway who showed me on the map the best places to visit in Beijing, and he was completely silent because he already understood that we wouldn't understand each other if we tried to speak. But we had some kind of positive interaction. Once also on the last day, I was under the heavy rain and was completely soaked. And some old ladies just pointed at me and smiled and tried to tell me to cover myself and to be more careful because of the weather. But in Beijing, really, they speak English much better than anywhere else that I could see in China. We went to the cinema also to see a movie from Miyazaki, Hayao Miyazaki, the Japanese animation maker. And the seats were the most comfortable that I've seen because you could just recline the seats, and you had also some back massage. Though I don't really enjoy back massages, to be honest. By the way, speaking of that, I noticed that the Chinese cars are much more luxurious than in the West. They have lots of electric cars, especially taxis. They are most of them are electric, at least in the big cities. We use taxi a lot because it's really cheap, really comfortable, and it was the only time where it was completely silent when we would arrive at a crossing and the taxi would stop. And there was no noise at all because it was an electric car. When the windows were closed, it was the only time of the day that it was completely silent around. And it was such a relief to have 1 minute of complete silence. I didn't see any French restaurants. It's mostly only Chinese or Asian food. But I saw 2 Russian restaurants, and in some places there were things like signs which were written in Russian. So I guess that they tried to attract Russian tourists. It's actually interesting to see the interactions between Russians and Chinese because they feel close in a sense, and they have mostly positive opinions about each other. I mean, I'm not talking about politics here, but just on private people's opinion. And all the Russians around me are pretty curious about China, wanting to go to China at some point, considering Chinese as friends. And it's the same from China. They have a very positive idea of Putin, for example. But at the same time, the culture is really, really different. Russians are very much Westerners. And when I see Chinese people in Russia, they behave as if they were in China, being really loud, really noisy, really messy sometimes. And it's not at all how Russians behave. So for example, last time I came, I think it was from St. Petersburg or something, there was a whole wagon in the train which was filled with a Chinese group. And they were behaving like in China. So once again, just crowding and being really loud. And of course, it was a huge contrast with the Russians around, which were really civil, polite, and discreet and reserved. So there is a kind of attraction on both sides and goodwill towards each other and some kind of sense of closeness also because of history and because of nowadays politics. But at the same time, the culture is really different. But Chinese also seem to really like Russians and to be happy to see them around. On the last days, we went to Beidaihe, I don't know how to say this again. Anyway, it was a place close to the sea, and we had some seafood, though it was so spicy that I couldn't eat anything because I would become just completely red and cry and not taste anything anymore for the rest of my life. But we walked by the sea. We went to the end of the Great Hall, and there was a storm when we arrived, so we didn't enjoy the view so much. And then I went back to Beijing to take my plane. So I think 10 days is quite okay to start to have a feeling about a country, though of course you don't know much, but at least you can get a first idea. I really hope that I will be able to go back to China, especially to the south. In Beijing airport, they have a very beautiful airport, by the way. I will put some pictures. I wanted to buy some souvenirs, the last ones before I went, and I wanted to buy some chopsticks. So I found a beautiful box of chopsticks, and when I tried to pay for them, by the way, even in Beijing airports, they don't speak English. Nobody was speaking English among the employees, so we were still using Google Translate to communicate. So when I tried to pay for the chopsticks, the lady was really embarrassed, and she told me, oh, you're sure that you want to buy them, and so on. And she turned the box, and there was the face of Mao on it. So she told me, you know who is Mao and everything, you're sure that you want to buy them? And of course I knew who is Mao, and I live in Russia, so it doesn't really matter. I can bring back Mao and there is no problem. By the way, Mao seems to be a very popular figure in China, which I was surprised once again, though I shouldn't be surprised because it's a bit of the same experience that I had in Russia, that the vision of things that we have in France that I was taught by my history teachers, for example, at school, or by just general knowledge. We have a very negative idea of Putin, of the Soviet time and everything, and in Russia it's very different. But still, I was still surprised to see Mao so often and to see that he was still a very popular figure in China among the Chinese people. So that's it, I guess. I said everything and I feel exhausted because I talked for probably 2 hours. I will try to go back to China, definitely. I will try to learn a little bit of Chinese in the meantime. If I manage to do this and stay motivated, I really want to explore a little bit more around Shanghai and maybe less touristic places, but more natural ones. Seems that in China they have lot of really wonderful places, and I really want to see the mountains, for example. I already made a lot of Russians angry when I said that, but I think that nature in Russia is a little bit monotonous, can we say that? And I know that Crimea doesn't look like Novosibirsk, and I know that there are different types of landscapes in Russia, but you have to travel for thousands of kilometers to see any change, whereas where I come from in France, you travel for 200 kilometers and you feel like in another country. So I got spoiled and I got used to this kind of changing landscape, which is one of the best features of France, I would say, because we have many different natural beautiful places that are like completely different. And in Russia, if you go from Moscow to St. Petersburg or even around Siberia, to be honest, it was kind of the same landscape. Like you have trees, forest, and it's wonderful. I love it. But it's the same for thousands of kilometers. And also you don't have mountains in this whole area, which I missed because I really like mountains. And in China, in the south, they seem to have lots of mountains and they look really wonderful, like nothing I have seen before. And I just saw them from afar, but they seem to have very sharp edges and everything, and to be covered in vegetation. So I'm really curious about that. A little bit scared about mosquitoes and bugs, but that's okay. I will survive. So I really like this trip. It was the most interesting and wonderful trip I ever had, and it made me even more curious about China. So I will be back. Though I was really relieved to go back to Russia because I feel at home in Russia in a way that I never felt in any other country. Also, Moscow is so quiet and well organized and silent by comparison. So once again, for French people, go check my partner Logias Online if you want to better your skills in English. It's a completely online platform for learning English or Russian for French people. So if you're interested in traveling, be it to Russia or anywhere, it will make things much easier if you know the language. And Logias Online is a very good platform to improve your skills at your own pace, from your home, from the comfort of your home. So I will put the link in the description and you can use my code to get a little promotion, réduction. You see, I also need to go back to Logias Online. Ouch. Okay, water.